All right, so let's jump right into this this whole situation with the UK and their potential involvement in Ukraine. We're talking peacekeeping forces and Prime Minister Starmer's getting ready to head over to Kyiv to meet with Zelensky. So to unpack all of this, we've got a recent article from Le Crave, The Telegraph, and then some pretty strong opinions from their readers.
You know, what's really interesting to me is the timing of all of this. You've got Starmer's trip to Kyiv happening right after his meeting with Macron, where they discussed security guarantees for Ukraine. But what does that even mean?
Right.
Like, what do those guarantees actually look like when you actually get down to it? These are pretty important questions, right? Because the type of guarantee, whether it's military, economic, or something else entirely, it's going to have a huge impact on what happens to Ukraine and the UK's potential role in all of this.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So we've got Starmer going to Kyiv. Zelensky's confirmed they'll be talking about this peacekeeping force. And kind of underlying all of this is this feeling of uncertainty about how much international support Ukraine can actually count on going forward, especially with a new U.S. president coming in.
Exactly. And all of this uncertainty it fuels a lot of the anxiety we see in these reader comments. There's this sense of, I don't know, maybe the UK is biting off more than they can chew. Some people are even saying the UK might not even have enough troops to handle their existing NATO obligations, let alone send a bunch more over to Ukraine. So is that a valid concern? I mean, if we look at the numbers, the UK's got something like 150,000 active military personnel, and their NATO commitment is about 13,000 troops spread across different operations. So at least on paper, it seems like they might have some troops to spare. But it's not just about the numbers. You got to think about resources and logistics and whether this is going to overstretch an already busy military.
Yeah. And then you've got to hell it. The financial strain, that's a big point. A lot of the readers are bringing up peacekeeping missions are not cheap. And a lot of people are wondering if the UK can really afford this, especially with all the other economic issues they're dealing with. But let's kind of shift gears a little bit here before we get too deep into the reader comments. Can we just step back and talk about what we actually mean by a peacekeeping force? I mean, are we talking about just monitoring a ceasefire? Or would they be actively involved in pushing back if Russia attacks again? Because that would obviously change the level of risk for the UK, right?
Well, absolutely. That's a really important distinction to make. When you think about like a traditional peacekeeping force, they're usually sent in after there's already a peace agreement in place. And their main job is to just observe and monitor the ceasefire, help the two sides talk to each other, and try to build the conditions for a lasting peace. So they're typically lightly armed, and they operate under some pretty strict rules of engagement. But in a place like Ukraine, where things are still pretty volatile, and there's always that chance of the fighting starting up again, they might need a much stronger mandate and way heavier weapons to actually keep things under control and protect civilians. And this is where things get tricky for the UK, because taking a more active role in a potential conflict zone, it really raises the risks for their troops. And you can even drag them deeper into the conflict than they originally planned for.
So it sounds like this idea of a peacekeeping force is still pretty vague, and how much the UK would actually be involved is still very much up in the air. It could be anything from a small group of observers to a full-blown combat-ready force. No wonder people have such strong opinions about it.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of strong opinions, I think these reader comments really give you a sense of how much anxiety and how many different perspectives there are around this whole idea of sending troops to Ukraine.
Some of them are pretty harsh, actually. They're calling Starmer brainless for even thinking about it. There's a pretty strong feeling that the UK should focus on its own problems first, things like border security and what they see as uncontrolled immigration, instead of getting involved in another conflict overseas.
Right. And it's interesting how these comments kind of reflect this bigger debate about what the UK's role in the world should be. Some people see this whole Ukraine thing as a distraction from issues at home. They think it's going to be super expensive and that it won't really benefit the UK. But then you have others who see it as a moral obligation. It's a chance for them to stand up for a democracy that's under attack. And ultimately to protect the whole of Europe.
Yeah. And it's not just the Republic weighing in on this. You've got people like Andrew Dale, Jeremy Hunt, the former foreign secretary. He's saying that sending European troops might be the only way to actually keep Ukraine safe, especially considering the new U.S. president and their more cautious stance on getting involved in these kinds of situations.
Yeah, that statement from Hunt is pretty significant, I think it suggests. That the whole geopolitical situation might be shifting. We might be moving towards a world where Europe has to step up and be more assertive in guaranteeing Ukraine's security. And for the UK, that could mean having to make some really tough choices, potentially even at the expense of their own domestic priorities or other international commitments.
Okay, so let's recap here. Starmer's heading to Kyiv for this super important meeting with Zelensky, who's obviously pushing hard for this international peacekeeping force. But back in the UK, you have a public that's divided over the costs, the risks, and even whether this whole thing is worth it in the first place. And then you've got former officials like Hunt saying that Europe, especially the UK, needs to get more involved. So what happens now?
Well, this is where things start to get really interesting. I think we need to dig into what the potential risks and rewards are for the UK. What kind of pressures are they facing from other countries? And ultimately, what does all this mean for their future?
Okay, so we've set the scene here. You know, this potential peacekeeping force is on the table, but there are still a lot of questions about what it would actually look like. And back in the UK, public opinion is all over the place. So let's talk about what this all means for the UK. What are the risks and rewards they're facing with this decision?
Well, let's start with the risks, because they're definitely there, and they're pretty serious. We've already talked a bit about the financial and military strain this could put on the UK. Sending troops to a place like Ukraine and keeping them there, it's incredibly expensive, especially if they end up in a more active combat role. And the UK's economy is already facing some challenges. So committing to a long-term presence in Ukraine could really put a strain on their budget.
Right. And even if they could afford it, there's the whole question of whether they have enough troops. I mean, some of the readers are worried that sending troops to Ukraine would leave the UK vulnerable in other places. You know, they've got those NATO commitments and other things going on. So can they really handle another major operation without putting their own security at risk?
Yeah, that's a totally valid concern. And it's something that policymakers are going to have to think very carefully about. They need to look at where their troops are deployed right now and analyze what might happen in Ukraine. They need to figure out if they can realistically send troops over there without jeopardizing those other commitments or leaving themselves open to attack. And then there's the risk of escalation. Sending British troops into an active conflict zone, even if it's supposed to be a peacekeeping mission, it increases the chances they'll get pulled into direct combat with Russian forces.
Yeah, I mean, that's a scary thought. And I'm sure it's something that's on a lot of people's minds, especially those who remember the UK's involvement in other conflicts. But I think it's important to remember that there's another side to this. There are potential rewards for the UK if this peacekeeping mission actually works. So why would they take on all this risk?
Well, the rewards are mainly strategic. You know, a stable Ukraine acts as a buffer against Russian influence and helps to deter further aggression in the region. So for the UK and their European allies, a successful peacekeeping operation could make them a lot safer by preventing instability from spreading.
So it's not just about helping Ukraine, it's about protecting the UK's own interests and maintaining stability in their part of the world.
Exactly. Plus, a peaceful and prosperous Ukraine is good for the UK economically. It opens up new trade opportunities, strengthens regional partnerships, and makes it less likely that there will be future conflicts that could disrupt global markets.
And we can't forget about the moral dimension of this. The UK has been a strong supporter of Ukraine since this conflict began. Sending troops to help secure peace would show the world that they're serious about their commitment, and it would definitely strengthen their relationship with Ukraine and boost their reputation internationally.
Right? It would send a really powerful message about their willingness to stand up for their values and support a democracy that's under attack. But we have to remember that these rewards aren't guaranteed. A lot can go wrong. The UK is walking a tightrope here. They've got pressure coming from all sides, the U.S., Ukraine, their own people. And everyone has different expectations and different priorities.
So let's talk about those external pressures. We know the new U.S. administration is taking a more cautious approach to foreign interventions. So how might that affect the UK's decision on Ukraine?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. If the U.S. scales back its involvement, the UK and other European allies will be under a lot of pressure to fill the gap. But can they do that effectively without the U.S.? That's the big question.
And then there's the pressure coming from Ukraine. Zelensky's made it very clear that he wants boots on the ground. And he'll probably use this meeting with Starmer to try to get the strongest possible commitment from the UK.
Oh, absolutely. He's going to be talking about how strategically important Ukraine is, the risks of not doing anything, and the moral obligation to help a country that's been invaded. He's a very skilled communicator and a powerful advocate for Ukraine. So Starmer's going to face some tough questions. and some really compelling arguments.
It sounds like Starmer's in a really tough position. He has to weigh the risks and rewards for the UK, think about the political fallout back home, and navigate all of these
Complicated international pressures.
It's a really difficult decision, and there's no easy answer. So let's try to think this through. What are the long-term implications for the UK, depending on what they decide to do? Let's start with what seems like the most likely scenario. The UK agrees to send troops to the peacekeeping force, but they set some clear conditions. What might those conditions look like?
Well, I think they'd probably insist on a very clear mandate for the mission. They'd want to know exactly what its objectives are, what the rules of engagement are, and how they plan to eventually withdraw their troops. They probably also want a limited time frame for their involvement, maybe with a plan to gradually pull back as certain goals are met.
So they're basically testing the waters without committing to a long-term deployment. What else might they push for?
Well, they definitely want other European allies to share the burden. They won't want to be the only ones providing troops and money. And they'll almost certainly demand guarantees from Russia that they'll respect Ukraine's sovereignty and not attack again. Those guarantees would be really crucial for ensuring that their troops are safe and that the mission can actually succeed.
Yeah, that makes sense. But realistically, getting those guarantees from Russia might be pretty tough.
Absolutely. That's one of the big unknowns here. Can the UK and their allies really trust Russia to stick to any agreement? Or will they just break their promises again?
Okay, so that's one scenario, a cautious approach with conditions. What are some of the other possibilities? What happens if things go bad?
Well, one potential outcome, and it's not a good one, is that the peacekeeping mission falls apart. Maybe because the fighting starts again. Or because the different sides involved just can't cooperate. In that case, the UK could get drawn into a much bigger conflict. And that would have really serious consequences for their military, their economy, and their political stability.
That's a pretty bleak picture. What other options does the UK have? Could they just decide to stay out of it completely?
They could, but that would also have consequences. Refusing to participate could damage their relationship with Ukraine, strain their ties with their European allies, and even embolden Russia. It would also send a message to the rest of the world that the UK is backing away from its global commitments and that they're not willing to take risks to defend their values.
So it seems like they're in a no-win situation. It's a tough spot to be in, and the stakes are incredibly high. But let's change gears for a minute. We've been talking a lot about the geopolitical side of things, but what about the human element? How are people in the UK going to react to all of this? I mean, we've talked about those reader comments, but what about the general public?
Yeah, that's a really important piece of this puzzle. Starmer needs to understand
how people in the UK feel about getting involved in Ukraine.
He needs to know
what their concerns are, what they hope will happen, and whether they're willing to support a mission that could be expensive and risky. He's got a tough job ahead of him. As we've seen, public opinion is divided. And the debate is only going to get more intense as his meeting with Zelensky gets closer.
Absolutely. And this is where leadership really matters. Starmer needs to explain
what he sees as the UK's role in this conflict.
He needs to address people's concerns and make a strong case for why this is important, not just for Ukraine, but for the future of the UK. He needs to be honest about the challenges, but also optimistic about the possibility of success.
And he has to do all of this while everyone's watching him, both in the UK and around the world. It's a delicate balancing act. And the decisions he makes in the next few weeks could have a huge impact on his legacy and on the UK's place in the world. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the potential risks and rewards for the UK, the pressure they're facing from other countries, and even how people in the UK are feeling about all of this. But I guess what I keep coming back to is, what's the main takeaway here? What do you really want our listeners to understand?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the UK's decision on Ukraine, it's about way more than just Ukraine. This is a defining moment for them. It's going to shape how they see themselves in the world, how they relate to other powerful countries like the US and Russia, and how committed they are to keeping Europe safe. Whatever they decide to do, it's going to have consequences for years to come, both at home and on the international stage.
And it's a decision that they're going to have to make with everyone watching. You know, we talked about those reader comments, and they really show you just how strongly people feel about this.
Yeah, for sure. Those comments are just a small glimpse into the hopes and fears that are driving this whole debate. And I think it's so important to understand those different perspectives, to really grasp what a huge challenge this is for the UK and what the potential consequences are.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I have to ask, what's next? What should our listeners be paying attention to as the story unfolds?
Well, for now, all eyes are on Starmer's trip to Kyiv. Those meetings with Zelensky could be really decisive. I mean, will they come to some kind of agreement on this peacekeeping force? What exactly will the UK agree to do? And how will those commitments be received by the UK public, by their European allies, and maybe most importantly, by Russia?
Yeah, and then you've got this whole question of the new U.S. administration and what their approach to Ukraine is going to be. Their level of involvement or lack of involvement is going to be a big factor in the UK's decision-making process. It's like a big, complicated game of chess, and we're still in the early stages.
That's a great way to put it. And the stakes are incredibly high. We're talking about the future of Ukraine, the balance of power in Europe, and the fundamental principles of international law and order. The decisions that are made in the coming weeks and months are going to have a huge impact on all of that.
It really feels like we're entering a new era in global politics, and the UK is right at the center of it.
You said it.
Yeah.
And how this all plays out is still up in the air. So to our listeners, I'd say, stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, keep asking those tough questions. Because the choices being made today are going to shape the world we all live in tomorrow.
Couldn't agree more. This has been a really insightful conversation, and I'm sure our listeners are just as eager as we are to see how this all unfolds. But for now, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.